Chapter 1. The Red Room. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. It was too gloomy, windy, and wet. Instead, we had to amuse ourselves indoors. My cousins Eliza, John, and Georgiana Reed were in the drawing room, gathered around their mother by the fireside, but I was not allowed to join the group. "You, Jane, are excluded from our company until I hear from Bessie that you can behave like a proper sweet little girl," Mrs. Reed had announced. "What does Bessie say I have done?" I asked. "Don't answer me back," she snapped. "Go and sit somewhere else until you can speak nicely." Obeying her, I went to the breakfast room. I took one of the books I loved best, Buick's History of British Birds, from the bookcase and climbed into the large window seat. I drew the curtain closed, sealing myself inside my own little space next to the window. As the wind and rain battered the glass, I immersed myself in another world. I loved to gaze at the seagull nestling on its rocky ledge and the long-eared owl standing watch over a dark churchyard. But my peace was soon shattered. "Hey, Jane Eyre!" John Reed had come into the room. "Where has she gone, Eliza? Tell Mama, Jane's run away." "She's in the window seat, John, to be sure," came his sister's voice. I pulled the heavy curtain aside before he could drag me out. There he stood, bulky and brainless, with flabby cheeks and ugly, sneering grin. John was 14, 4 years older than me, and he bullied and attacked me constantly. No one in the house ever stopped him. The servants didn't dare to upset him, and his mother wouldn't hear a word said against him. I hated and feared him with every bone in my body. "Stop hiding behind curtains and sneaking about, you little rat," he said. Then he suddenly hit me hard across the face. "That's for being rude to my mother," he said. "And what were you doing behind that curtain?" "Just reading." "Show me the book." I handed him the book of birds. "You have no right to read our books," he taunted. "You're no better than a beggar, Mother says. You have no money, and she only looks after you out of the goodness of her heart. Now I'll teach you to go rummaging through my things. Go and stand over there facing the door." I did as he said, then waited, flinching. Sure enough, he hurled the heavy book at me. It hit my head and I fell, cutting my face on the doorframe. Suddenly, my fear had gone and I was filled with burning anger. I picked myself up and through my tears I screamed at him, "You're a wicked monster. You're no better than a murderer or a slave driver." He ran headlong at me and grabbed my hair. I flailed and scratched at his face with my hands as he wrestled me to the ground. "You little rat!" he shouted again. "Help! Help! Jane is attacking me!" The next thing I knew, the servants had pulled us apart, and Mrs. Reed was standing over me. "Dear, dear," said Abbott, shaking her head. "What a fury, to fly at Master John like that. Such a little firebrand," Bessie tutted. "Take her away," said Mrs. Reed, "and lock her in the Red Room. That will teach her a lesson." The Red Room was the biggest, grandest bedroom in Gateshead Hall. It had a red carpet, red damask drapery, and a dark mahogany 4-poster bed with red velvet curtains. But nobody slept there. Nobody wanted to. It was here, 9 years before, in that very bed, that Mr. Reed had died. Ever since then, the room had been unused, and I had often heard the servants whispering that it was haunted. Bessie and Abbott had to use all their strength to drag me up the stairs and force me through the door. I only stopped struggling when they threatened to tie me to a chair if I didn't behave. "I never saw such a disagreeable child," said Abbott, straightening her pinafore. "Miss Eyre, you should be grateful to Mrs. Reed for keeping you," said Bessie in a kinder voice. "If you don't behave, she might send you away, and then where would you be?" "Come on, Bessie," said Abbott. "You'd better say your prayers, miss, and ask for forgiveness." They left, and I heard the click of the door being locked. Left alone, Holding furiously onto the chair I had been pushed into, I turned the afternoon's events over and over in my mind. Why was I treated so unfairly? Why was John Reed allowed to be rude and violent to me while I was punished for simply defending myself? And why did everyone adore selfish, spoiled Georgiana and Eliza and hate me, even though I tried to be good? Was it because they were pretty, with their golden curls and silk dresses, while I was poor and plain? It was starting to get dark in the Red Room, and I had no candle. It was cold, too, as the fire was never lit. As the daylight faded, the furniture began to form frightening shadows all around me. I thought about Mr. Reed, lying in his grave. He had been my uncle, my mother's brother. When my parents had died, I was a baby, and my Uncle Reed had brought me to live at Gateshead Hall. Bessie had told me that Mrs. Reed only continued to look after me because, just before his death, Mr. Reed had made her promise that she would. He would have been kind to me, I was sure. Perhaps his spirit was watching and was angry about the way they bullied me. Perhaps. I gripped the chair more tightly and felt a chill of terror. Perhaps his ghost really did live in this room. The thought of seeing a ghost, even kind Mr. Reed's ghost, filled me with dread. I shrank back against the wall and stared into the darkness in a petrified panic, convinced a phantom figure was about to loom into view. At that moment, a strange, swaying spot of light glanced in through the window and began to hover slowly across the ceiling towards me. Looking back, I know it was probably nothing more than a footman carrying a lantern across the lawn, but in my terrified state of mind, I believed it was the ghost. I heard a blood-curdling scream and realized that it was me who was screaming. I flung myself out of my seat, rushed over to the door, and desperately shook the handle. I heard footsteps running along the hallway. The door was unlocked, and Bessie opened it. I clung to her as if she was my own mother. "Let me out, Bessie, please, please let me go to my own bed," I sobbed. "What is it?" she said, holding me tight. "What a dreadful scream." There was a light, and I thought a ghost would come. A likely story. It was Mrs. Reed, striding down the hall in her nightgown and cap. "Bessie, I told you to leave Jane alone." "But she screamed so loud, ma'am." "She's trying to trick us," Mrs. Reed said. "I can't abide deceitful little girls." And she tore me away from Bessie, pushed me back into the darkness, and slammed the door. Left alone once more, I curled up on the floor and sobbed until I could hardly breathe. In the end, I must have fallen unconscious, as that was the last thing I remembered.